sadistically, premeditatedly, deliberately tortured and murdered Yvette Pena. I don't have no sympathy. I'm sadistic. I really don't care. I'll do it and I'll do it again over and over and over.
On November 13, 2011, police were called after a body had been found in a motel room in Bakersfield, California, and found Yvette Pena murdered. The 36-year-old mother of 6 had been living at the motel, and she had suffered a number of traumatic injuries. The coroner ruled that Pena had died of a blunt force injuries, sharp force wounds, and asphyxia, with prosecutors describing what had been done to her as truly horrific. Jaime Osuna was arrested the same year when he was 23 years old, and initially claimed that though he was the last person alive to see her at the motel, he wasn't the murderer. Osuna pleaded not guilty and said he hoped Pena's family would be able to find the real murderer. Denied bail, he spent almost 6 years in county jail before agreeing to be interviewed in 2017, where he announced that he would be pleading guilty to murdering and torturing Pena in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. In the interview with KGD, the murderer showed no remorse for what he'd done, saying, "I did sadistically, premeditatedly, deliberately tortured and murdered Yvette Pena. I don't have no sympathy. I'm sadistic. I don't care. I'll do it and I'll do it again over and over and over." Elsewhere in the interview, Osuna said he killed animals when he was a child, saying that when his mother went out he'd put the cat in the freezer for 15 minutes before putting it in the oven. "I don't care if you're my brother or sister. I don't care if you're whoever. It's self-gratification." He also said about his motives to murder people. Osuna was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, meaning he will never be released from behind bars. 2 years later, he was found to have murdered his cellmate Luis Romero, whose body had been hacked to pieces. Romero, a 44-year-old man who had spent 27 years in prison for second-degree murder after fatally shooting a woman, was found on March 9, 2019 beheaded, stabbed in the eye, and with other parts of his body removed. Osuna was wearing a necklace made of parts of Romero's body and had written, "Ha ha ha," and "the man with 1,000 faces" on the walls using his victim's blood. The month after Romero was dissected, Osuna said he wanted to plead not guilty, and in 2020 the murderer then said he would plead guilty. It's a truly horrific story, but to understand how it all started, we need to look back at Jaime Osuna's beginnings. Jaime Osuna was born on March 7, 1988, in Bakersfield, California. He grew up in a home that was anything but happy. His mother, Michelle, had a rough start with Jamie's father, who was mean and hurtful. Michelle hoped that having Jaime would change him, but instead, the troubles only grew worse. Even while she was pregnant, Jamie's father did something awful. He kicked her in the stomach. This horrible act caused Jaime to be born with a cleft ear, a reminder of the pain he endured even before he took his first breath. After some time, Michelle decided to leave Jamie's father and found a new partner named Jeff. But things didn't get better. They got worse. Jeff didn't want anything to do with Jaime or his older brother. He acted like a monster instead of a father. One day, when Jaime was just a little baby, the family went on a fishing trip. During the drive home, Jaime started crying. His stepfather Jeff lost his temper. In a shocking moment, he opened the car door and pushed Jamie's car seat right out of the moving car. Miraculously, little Jaime survived this horrifying act. The car seat landed upright and, unbelievably, he had no visible injuries. You would think that after such a dangerous incident, Jeff and Jamie's mother, Michelle, would rush him to the hospital. But instead, they decided not to take him for help. It's hard to understand why they wouldn't seek medical attention after such a terrible thing. As Jaime grew older, it became clear that this incident had lasting effects. Doctors later discovered that he had suffered brain damage from being thrown out of the car. This was just the beginning of a life filled with pain and suffering. Jaime wasn't the only one facing Jeff's wrath. His older half-brother also endured abuse. In one frightening episode, Jeff threw a fork at him, causing an injury that left its mark. Eventually, Jamie's half-brother couldn't take it anymore and moved in with their grandparents. He managed to find some stability there, living a relatively normal life away from the chaos. But But Jaime was not so lucky. He had to stay with Michelle and Jeff, trapped in an abusive home where love was scarce. Rumors swirled that Jaime's grandfather disliked him for reasons unknown, which broke Jaime's heart. He would often pray to be allowed to live with his grandparents, but was always left behind in the darkness of his home. Instead of finding safety and comfort, Michelle and Jeff decided to have 2 more children together. Strangely enough, Jeff became a loving father to these new kids, but continued to treat Jaime with cruelty. Jeff made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with Jaime. During family dinners, while everyone else enjoyed their meals, Jaime sat at the table with nothing to eat. He watched in despair as his siblings filled their bellies while he starved. When they finished eating, Jeff would toss Jaime's food on the floor like he was a dog. The punishments didn't stop there. Jeff would lock Jaime outside in the cold as a form of punishment. One rainy day, Jeff locked him out without shoes or socks while Jaime banged on the door, crying for help. Instead of letting him in, Jeff just laughed from upstairs, enjoying the torment he inflicted on the helpless boy. One day, his stepfather Jeff, in a fit of rage, slammed the window shut so hard that it shattered. The broken glass rained down on little Jaime, cutting him all over. This time, the injuries were serious enough that Jaime had to be taken to the hospital. Can you imagine how scared he must have been? When Jaime was just 5 years old, another horrible incident occurred. He accidentally spilled some juice on the floor, and Jeff lost his temper again. What happened next is so terrible that it made many people cry. Jeff tied Jaime to a tree and whipped him with his belt until blood dripped from his tiny body. Thankfully, Michelle finally stepped in and called 911. But by the time the police arrived, Jeff had untied Jaime. Although the officers could see the marks on Jaime's skin and arrested Jeff for child cruelty, he only pleaded guilty and was back home just days later. It's hard to believe that someone could hurt a child so badly and then be allowed to return to the same house. Jaime must have felt utterly alone and abandoned. His mother didn't stand up for him, and even his grandfather seemed to despise him. Jaime often asked Michelle why she chose Jeff over him, but she never had a good answer. In interviews later, she admitted she was weak and could have done something to stop the abuse but didn't. As time went on, Jaime's life continued to spiral downward. He lived in a world where everyone seemed against him. His mother didn't protect him, and even his uncle threw bricks at him. When Jaime turned 12, he began to realize that what he experienced wasn't normal. He asked his mom again and again why he was being treated this way. Eventually, after much persistence, he moved in with his grandparents. You would hope this would be a fresh start for Jaime, but sadly, it wasn't enough to heal the wounds of his past. Even though he was out of that abusive home, Michelle said Jaime seemed completely detached from everything around him, as if all joy had been drained from his life. The damage done during those early years was too great, emotionally and physically. He even suffered from brain damage due to that terrible incident when he was thrown from the car seat. At 15 years old, Jaime found himself in trouble again when he stabbed another boy and ended up in juvenile detention for 4 years. This time in prison made Michelle finally realize she needed to leave Jeff for good. She escaped from that nightmare of a relationship just as Jeff passed away from a heart attack while Jaime was still locked up. It's important to note that Jeff had also faced abuse as a child. However, that doesn't excuse the horrors he inflicted on Jaime. The cycle of violence continued through generations, leaving behind scars that would last a lifetime. After spending time in prison, Jaime Osuna was released on September 14, 2007, at the age of 19. What happened next in his life is a bit of a mystery. He didn't have a job and was rumored to be involved with gangs. Then, in December 2008, Jaime attended a house party that would change his life forever. This wasn't just any party. It was hosted by a woman named Jane, a 37-year-old single mom celebrating her son's 16th birthday. Jane wanted to be the cool mom, so she provided alcohol for the teenagers at the party, even though many were underage. She was having a great time dancing and enjoying herself when her nephew noticed her dancing with a younger man and didn't like it one bit. In an attempt to protect his aunt, he looked for someone to scare off the young man. That's when he found Jaime. Jaime didn't know Jane or her son but offered to help. However, instead of just scaring the guy away, Jaime grabbed a knife from the kitchen and threatened the young man. In a shocking turn of events, Jaime ended up stabbing him. Fortunately, the injury wasn't serious, but it led to police being called. Jaime was arrested for violating his parole and assault with a deadly weapon. Jane also received a citation for supplying alcohol to minors. This wild encounter marked the beginning of Jaime's relationship with Jane. While it might seem like an unusual way to meet someone, they started writing letters while he was back in prison after the incident. To many people, this would have been a huge red flag, but Jane responded to his letters anyway. As their relationship blossomed through their letters, they grew closer. When Jaime was set to be released again in November 2009, just under a year after that chaotic party, Jane came to pick him up from prison. She was in for quite a surprise. While he had gone into prison without any facial tattoos, he came out with striking designs that included a creepy smile and clown-like features under one eye. When Jaime got into Jane's car, he suggested they go to a motel together. Surprisingly, she agreed. They spent the night together, thinking it might be just a one-time fling. But soon after, Jane discovered she was pregnant. Jaime was thrilled about becoming a father and wanted to step up and be involved in the child's life. He convinced Jane that they should try being together as a family. At first, everything seemed perfect. Jaime was attentive and caring toward her needs during her pregnancy. He even proposed to Jane because he wanted to do things right and believed in being married before bringing their child into the world. Jaime and Jane got married in February 2010, just 3 months after she found out she was pregnant. The wedding was small and took place at Jaime's grandmother's house, but soon after, things began to take a dark turn. Jaime, who had once been caring and attentive, started to show his true colors. He became both mentally and physically abusive toward Jane, and the violence continued even as her pregnancy progressed. One day, during a heated argument, Jaime crossed a terrible line. In a fit of rage, he grabbed the ashes of Jane's mother, something she cherished deeply, and ran out of the house with them. This act was particularly cruel because Jane had already been struggling with the loss of her mother. When Jane called the police, they arrived and arrested Jaime, but unfortunately, they never recovered her mother's ashes. Jaime went back to prison for domestic abuse shortly after this incident. While he was locked up, Jane gave birth to their son. But Jaime wasn't keeping his promises to be a good father. He spent about 6 months in prison before being released on parole in February 2010. Jane decided to give him another chance, hoping they could make things work for the sake of their child. However, things only got worse. During this time, Jaime began using methamphetamine, which made him even more violent and unpredictable. The abuse continued relentlessly, and Jane became numb to it all. It was as if she had stopped reacting altogether. This lack of response frustrated Jaime even more because he thrived on getting reactions from others. In a shocking move to provoke Jane, Jaime targeted her 7-year-old son. He shoved the boy from the bed onto the floor right in front of Jane, clearly trying to get a rise out of her. And it worked. Jane snapped. She pulled out a knife on Jaime, finally reaching her breaking point. In that moment, she saw fear in his eyes. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Feeling threatened, Jaime called his grandmother to come pick him up and left the house without harming anyone. But it wasn't long before he returned to harass Jane again. This time, she had had enough. She immediately called the police when he showed up again, leading to another arrest for Jaime for violating his parole. Jaime spent 7 months in prison this time and was released on Halloween 2011. While he was locked up, Jane felt safe for the first time in a long while. But as soon as he got out, he began harassing her again. Jane was terrified. She repeatedly called 911, but every time the police arrived, Jaime was nowhere to be found. There was even a warrant out for his arrest, but the police couldn't catch him. This all happened within just the first week of his release. Then, on November 8th, just 8 days after he got out, Jane received a shocking phone call from Jaime. Unlike his previous calls where he threatened her, this time he said something chilling. "Put on the news. I just killed a woman at the Morocco Motel." Jane's heart raced as she realized the gravity of what he was saying. Knowing Jaime's violent nature, she immediately called 911 again, hoping someone would take action. Unfortunately, nothing was done right away. Just 5 days later, a worker at the Al Morocco motel discovered the body of 37-year-old Yvette Pena. When police investigated the scene, they soon connected Jaime to the murder. Although it's unclear why they suspected him so quickly, Jane's earlier phone call likely raised alarms. It's also believed that Jaime's DNA was present at the crime scene. The details surrounding Yvette's death were horrific. An autopsy revealed she had suffered blunt force injuries, sharp force injuries, and asphyxia. She had been found gagged with sharp instruments protruding from her back. Investigators described the crime scene as one of the worst they had ever encountered in their careers, suggesting that Yvette had been tortured slowly and sadistically before being killed. When police questioned Jaime about Yvette's murder, he denied any involvement. He claimed that Jane was lying about his confession to set him up and insisted that he barely knew Yvette, who was a complete stranger to him. However, investigators noted that Yvette bore a resemblance to Jane and wondered if Jaime had taken out his rage on someone who looked like his wife. Despite his denials, there was enough evidence to charge Jaime with first-degree murder for Yvette Pena's death. He went back to jail awaiting trial and used his time there to get even more tattoos, transforming his appearance dramatically. While in prison, Jaime continued to harass Jane relentlessly. He made threatening phone calls and even enlisted other inmates to contact her with threats of revenge. But it didn't stop there. Jaime also tried to have Jane's children taken away from her by writing false reports to Child Protective Services over several months. In one particularly disturbing incident, Jane received letters from Jaime written in blood and filled with satanic language signed with pentagrams. One letter contained a smashed-up dead rat. It was unclear how Jaime managed to send such a gruesome gift. Perhaps he had someone on the outside help him, but it only added to Jane's terror. As the situation escalated, it became clear that Jaime Osuna was not just a man with a troubled past. He was becoming a monster whose actions would haunt Jane for years to come. While still in jail, he took things to a horrifying new level. He was caught with a letter addressed to someone on the outside containing instructions to kill Jane. It was clear that Jaime was determined to make Jane's life a living nightmare. During this chaotic time, Jane faced her own troubles. She was arrested for child cruelty, not because of Jaime's false claims, but due to an incident where she hit one of her children. When Jaime found out about this, he saw it as an opportunity to further torment her. He wanted to have Jane killed by another inmate and even managed to get her prison number, putting a price on her head. Thankfully, authorities intercepted this letter before any harm could come to Jane. Jane also experienced a terrifying incident while being transferred between jails. She was placed in a transport van with another inmate when Jaime, held in a separate cell within the same van, instructed the woman to attack her. As the van moved, the other inmate violently assaulted Jane while she screamed for help. The guards, however, did nothing to intervene. They dismissed her pleas and told her to suck it up. Miraculously, Jane escaped this ordeal mostly unharmed, but it left her shaken and led to a nervous breakdown. Despite all this chaos, Jaime later claimed he wished he had killed Jane that day in the van. Meanwhile, Yvette Pena's family was left waiting for justice. They suffered immensely knowing that Yvette, a loving mother of 6, had been taken from them far too soon. Yvette had faced her own struggles in life but had always been caring and devoted to her family. Her sister was especially heartbroken over the loss. The wait for Yvette's murder trial stretched on for 5 long years due to numerous delays and court appearances. Each time they faced Jaime in court, he would taunt them with smiles and waves, showing no remorse for his horrific actions. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, Jaime continued to deny his involvement in Yvette's murder. Finally, a trial date was set for March 27, 2017. However, just 3 days before the trial began, Jaime agreed to an interview with a journalist. The plan was for the reporter to question him and possibly catch him slipping up about his guilt. But Jaime didn't wait for the cameras to roll. He boldly declared, "I did it. I'm guilty. I'm sadistic. I really don't care. I'll do it again and again." For 5 years, he had denied his involvement in Yvette Pena's murder, but just 3 days before his trial, he admitted to it. The interview continued, with the reporter pushing Jaime for more details. He began to open up about his troubled childhood, revealing the abuse he suffered and how it led him down a dark path. Jaime recounted disturbing tales of animal cruelty from when he was just a child, saying, "Since I was a kid, 8 or 9 years old, I killed animals." He described how he would put a cat in the freezer and then in the oven, horrifying acts that hinted at his deep-seated issues. Jaime also spoke about self-harm, admitting that he started at age 12 because he wanted to feel something, anything, even if it was pain. He explained that this desire for sensation fueled his addiction to violence and ultimately led him to murder. "It's a rush. It's an addiction," he said. "I would rather do that than do drugs or have sex with the most beautiful woman in the world." His words painted a picture of someone who found gratification in chaos and destruction. In an even more shocking twist, Jaime confessed to 2 additional murders before Yvette's death, one when he was just 13 years old. When asked about these victims, he hesitated but admitted that one was a 32-year-old woman. The details surrounding these murders remained vague as Jaime expressed reluctance to discuss them. Despite his confessions, Jaime's trial proceeded as planned just 3 days later. However, instead of facing the full consequences of his actions in court, he accepted a plea deal that allowed him to avoid the death penalty by pleading guilty. This decision frustrated prosecutors who had spent over 2 years preparing for the trial and believed Jaime deserved the ultimate punishment for his heinous crimes. The prosecutor stated, "If anyone deserves the death penalty, it's Jaime Osuna." Yet, instead of facing justice for his actions, Jaime was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Throughout the sentencing hearing, he smirked and waved at Yvette's family, showing no remorse for the pain he had caused them. Once in prison, it became evident that Jaime was far too dangerous to have a cellmate. His violent tendencies continued to manifest during his time behind bars. He had been caught with weapons on multiple occasions and constantly threatened other inmates. In one alarming incident, Jaime managed to sneak into another inmate's cell and attacked him viciously, stabbing him multiple times and causing severe injuries. He required 67 stitches for his injuries. Disturbingly, Jaime requested photographs of the injuries as trophies, wanting to relive the horror he had inflicted. Thankfully, he did not receive these photos, but his actions were a clear indication of his twisted mindset. In prison, Jaime often wrote messages on the walls of his cell using blood. In one shocking incident, he somehow acquired a carton of blood and threw it at a prison guard. His violent outbursts and disturbing behavior led authorities to determine that he was far too dangerous to have a cellmate. However, in March 2019, everything changed when Jaime was assigned a cellmate named Luis Romero. Luis was a 44-year-old man who had spent 27 years in prison for second-degree murder. He was nearing the end of his sentence and was eligible for parole. But just 24 hours after being placed in the same cell as Jaime, Luis was found dead. The scene was horrific. Jaime had crafted a weapon from a razor and string, which he used to brutally attack Luis. He cut off one of Luis's fingers, gouged out his eyes, removed part of his ribs, and even decapitated him. To add to the gruesome display, Jaime carved a Joker-like smile onto Luis's face and wore a necklace made from his body parts. On the wall of the cell, Jaime wrote in blood, "I am the man with 1,000 faces." The details surrounding this murder were so shocking that they left investigators reeling. It raised serious questions about how such an atrocity could happen in a prison that was supposed to be monitored closely. Reports indicated that checks were supposed to occur every 30 minutes. Yet the murder took much longer than that. Rumors circulated that this incident may have been set up, either for Jaime to attack Luis or vice versa. Corcoran Prison, where Jaime Osuna was incarcerated, had a notorious reputation for violence and corruption. One of the most shocking revelations about the prison was that guards would actually set up fights between inmates, gladiator style, and take bets on the outcomes. These fights were organized like events, complete with a ringside announcer, making it a spectacle for the guards. Worse still, there were reports that during these staged fights, guards would use the chaos as an excuse to shoot inmates. Over 5 years, 50 inmates were shot by prison guards, with 7 of them dying from their injuries. This brutal culture extended to placing certain inmates in cells with others for the purpose of setting up fights. similar to what happened with Jaime and his cellmate Luis Romero. Inmates with notorious nicknames, like the Booty Bandit, were deliberately placed in cells with other prisoners as punishment. This culture of violence and exploitation seemed to go unchecked, as no guards faced consequences for their actions. When Jaime was put in a cell with Luis Romero, many speculated that this could have been a setup. Just 24 hours after they were placed together, Luis was found dead in their cell. Reports later indicated that prison guards falsely claimed they had conducted welfare checks on Luis and Jaime's cell after the murder. An investigation revealed that 2 officers lied about seeing Luis alive during nighttime checks, despite a sheet blocking the view into the cell. Jaime had hung a white bed sheet over the cell door, which should have raised immediate red flags for the guards. The fact that they failed to check on the inmates for hours allowed Jaime to commit his horrific crime without interference. There are several signs that suggest Jaime Osuna was indeed inspired by the Joker. His infamous smile and the tattoos around his eyes were designed to make him look more like a clown. In fact, he would even cut into his smile tattoo to enhance its resemblance to the Joker's grin. After murdering Luis Romero, Jaime went so far as to carve a smile into Luis's face. He also wrote a letter to the district attorney while in prison, enclosing a photo of the DA with a drawn-on smile. Similar to what the Joker does in The Dark Knight, he signed the letter with the phrase, "Why so serious?" Jaime's obsession with the Joker extended to messages he wrote on the walls of his cell, quoting lines from Batman comics. This raises questions about whether his actions were merely coincidental or if he truly drew inspiration from the character. Jaime seemed to enjoy playing games with people, often keeping his true intentions hidden. There are notable similarities between Jaime and the Joker. Both are ruthless and cold, killing without remorse. Jaime displayed a resourcefulness reminiscent of the Joker's cunning nature. However, when it comes to the 2 additional murders Jaime claimed to have committed, skepticism arises. While he provided details such as the approximate ages of his victims and when and where these murders occurred, there has been no evidence found to support these claims. If he had truly committed those murders, it seems likely that law enforcement would have linked him to them by now. Some speculate that Jaime fabricated these additional murders to enhance his notorious reputation and appear more intimidating in prison. Standing at only 5 foot 6 inches tall, Jaime was smaller than many inmates in Corcoran Prison, which has a fearsome reputation. It's not far-fetched to think he might have exaggerated his past to avoid being seen as weak among larger inmates. Interestingly, Jaime's half-brother, who escaped their abusive home life and went to live with their grandparents, became a successful businessman with a loving family and a nice home. This stark contrast raises questions about what Jaime's life could have been like had he also been saved from abuse. As for Jaime's future, there may still be a trial for Luis's murder on the horizon. However, in 2021, Jaime was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial for this case, meaning he cannot face justice until he is considered mentally fit again. The question remains, what truly drives Jaime Osuna? Is it rooted in his childhood trauma and brain injury from when he was thrown from a moving car? Or did it stem from deeper issues related to his upbringing? Perhaps it is simply pure evil manifesting itself in horrific ways. His claims of being a Satanist, evidenced by pentagram tattoos, add another layer of complexity. However, many believe he uses this persona for dramatic effect rather than genuine belief.